Hello everybody. So we'll have two components in today's class as a continuation of the last class topic, multi-layer perceptron or neural networks in general. So I'll just look at two applications of a multi-layer perceptron, one in both in psychology and just cognitive science kind of thing, just to show that how flexibly the same models can be used and applied to a variety of problems. So with that intuition, right, then we'll go ahead and start discussing the organization of our system. So we'll look at just two examples, not all of them. So this first one of the earliest problems that was taken up, for study using MLP was something called past tense learning. So this is from linguistics. So it's about how children learn past tense. So this is in the English past tense. So the thing is, it was observed by psychologists for a long time that when children learn past tense forms of verbs, right, there is a typical pattern to that their development, there's language development when it comes to past tense learning. So there are several stages in this learning. In the earliest stage, children are exposed to a small number of verbs and the corresponding past tense. So these verbs are commonly occurring verbs, and their past tense forms also they don't have any fixed pattern. So usually when you learn past tense, there is a standard pattern. You just add either an ed or a d at the end of it, right? Looked, and so on and so forth. But when you look at some of the basic words, most commonly occurring words like come and came, and give and gave and all that, they don't have that ed or d ending. They're slightly they're like exceptions. But the problem is in the early stages, most words are exceptions. They're what are called irregular verbs. Right? Regular verbs have a standard ending of a d or ed. So the children make a standard kind of an error when they learn or acquire these verbs. So let us see how it works. So in stage one, children make just pick up simple words like came, got, and give, and looked, and so on and so forth. Took, went, and most of these verbs are irregular, and the children just learn them effortlessly because it's a small stock of words, and they seem to just memorize it. Like a lookup table. This is the present tense form, and this is the past tense form. But in stage two, children are exposed to much wider variety of verbs, a larger stock of vocabulary. And most of these verbs are, are regular. So like, wipe and wipe, pull and pulled, and so on. Now something interesting happens. When children get to second stage, they start messing up the past tense of their first stage verbs. Because first stage verbs, most of them are irregular, right? Like come and give and all that. And they have their own characteristic ending, unique ending, not D or ED. So now that they're exposed to lots of words with a regular ending or a standard ending, D or ED, they start misapplying this kind of a regularized ending to the words that have learned long ago. So like, they might say, for example, the past tense of come is comed or came, right? Both are obviously wrong. So they do that for a period in some intermediate stage, the second stage. But as they keep on acquiring more and more verbs, and as they get into what can be described as the third stage, right here they're exposed to even more verbs, hundreds of verbs, and by this time they're able to resolve this conflict between regular ending and irregular ending. And so now by this time they're able to correct their kind of erroneous spelling from stage two, right? And they're able to handle the irregular verbs in their own characteristic fashion. And regular verbs anyway never had any problem because it has standard and simple ending. So this three-stage development is often seen in children. Now, people before that, before neural networks came along, psychologists propose all sorts of strange theories about why this is happening. But when neural networks came along, people just trained the neural network on past tense learning and showed that the neural network also made very similar mistakes, just like children. So we don't need a very complicated brain model of how brain processes language and things like that, right? It's a very simple network. In fact, it's not even a multi-layer perceptron. It's just a perceptron, right, without a hidden layer. And such a simple model could show some of the error patterns of children as they acquire verbs and their past tense forms. So in this network, when it is trained in 3 stages. There are the 3 sets of words or verbs. So there are 10 high frequency verbs. These are that is commonly occurring verbs. Among them, 8 are irregular and 2 are regular. The words taken are given here: came, get, give, right, look, take, go, have, live, and so on. Then you have a 410 medium frequency verbs. Among them, 334 are regular and 76 are irregular. And note that most verbs are regular, right? A minority are irregular. So you can see that kind of a relative distribution of regular and irregular verbs in the data sets taken for training. And in thirds, and then you have 86 low frequency words. So the verbs are divided into their relative frequency of occurrence in day-to-day use. So then 86 low frequency words, out of them 72 are regular and 14 are irregular. So these 3 sets of words are taken and the network is trained like this. So the input to the network is a verb in present tense form, output is a past tense form. So they figured out some way of representing a word as a vector of a standard dimension. Because the problem with words is they can have multiple dimensions. I mean, they can have multiple number of characters. They could be of varying length. Whereas a neural network like an MLP can only understand a vector of fixed dimension. So they found some way of representing the characters as standard size vector, which communicates underlying phonetics of the word. So in the first stage, they have presented these words and only the high frequency verbs, the very first set, right? All this came, get, give, and all. And the network learned well because it's a small data set and gave good performance. Then after about 10 epochs, the 410 medium frequency verbs were added, right? And so then they were trained for 190 more epochs after the first stage. And now suddenly a new errors start creeping in. So in the stage 1, the network quickly learned them and no errors, right, on those small set of verbs. But moment it was exposed to new set of words, this 410 medium frequency verbs, and suddenly it started messing up its spelling on the messing up the past tense forms on the previously known set of verbs. What was doing well, now it started messing up. And this error is due to wrong regularization, right, of irregular verbs. Then in stage 3, 86 low frequency verbs were tested without training. This is just testing. And beyond stage 2, the performance over regulars and irregulars is nearly the same. And each touching. So after this, once it reached stage 3, it was okay. But in the early parts of stage 2, it started making mess. So look at these 2 graphs. On the y-axis, you see percentage features correct. X-axis is trials, right? And so you see the solid dark black curve is regular performance over regular verbs, which is constantly increasing, and there is no kind of fluctuation in that. Whereas on the irregular word performance, so because in any given state, any given training stage, both kinds of words are present in the training set. So here they are segregating the regular and irregular verbs and showing performance. So you see that after about that 10 epochs, right, suddenly the error started, performance started dipping for irregular verbs, just like what you would see in children. And slowly, as the network is trained on a large stock of words, it's able to resolve this conflict and slowly perform better on the irregulars also. So by about 200 epochs, it started performing very similarly on regular and irregulars. So that's a very simple study, especially by modern standards, by current day standards, where people are training large deep networks with billions of parameters. I mean, 10 power 9 parameters, weights, and all that. This is a very simple model, but we're talking about like almost 35 years ago. That was when the study was done. Okay, so then let's look at NetTalk. This is again a network MLP that is trained to read text aloud. All right, and so this network was trying to read English text aloud, and it can pronounce letters accurately based on context. Because the problem with English is this problem doesn't arise as much in Indian languages. In Indian language, every character is how to pronounce it is simply conveyed by the character itself. You don't have to worry about the context. I mean, at least not a whole lot. Tamil, it is a bit more than other languages. So in Hindi, for example, you have to change your pronunciation based on whether you're at the end of the word or something. There is something called schwa deletion. Right? For example, if you write nagar, the last letter is ra. You don't read it as nagara. You read it as nagar. And that's the rule that in the last letter you have to remove the implicit vowel r. So there's some few rules like that. There's a little bit of context dependency, but nothing like what you see in English. Whereas in other Indian language, it is not even there. Even that little context dependency is not there, or is very little. So English, for example, you have 2o is pronounced as two and go is pronounced as go, and so there's even jokes about it in movies, right? And c is pronounced as ka in cat and sa as in facade, and uh, the AV form, right? The letters form a long vowel in gave and brave, but not in have. Have is different and gave. The sound is quite different. So similarly, EA is pronounced as read, in present tense and read in, past tense. And so all sorts of context dependencies which make pronunciation or, reading text aloud a fairly hard problem. So this is way back from 1989. So this network is trained to read text and it is given a short string of characters as input. And they're taken 26 alphabets, all the English alphabets. There is no separate uppercase and lowercase. And they also taken 3 punctuation marks, comma, full stop, and blank space, because that's important to modulate your pronunciation. Because if you're at an end of a sentence, you pronounce the word in one way. If you're in the middle, you pronounce it differently. And you might have seen this in some of these railway reservation, or not railway announcements that you hear in a railway station. So for example, when you say train is supposed to come, they expect it to come on platform number 5. You're supposed to decrease your volume and also lower your pitch. You can't say platform number 5, which is odd, right? It should be platform number 5. So that depends on the context. But thing is, since the recording is done on just independent words and symbols, right? This kind of a what is called prosody may or may not be taken care of in that text-to-speech conversion system. So all these little context dependencies that you have to worry. Therefore, you need to have a little bit of punctuation also added to the input text. So here there are the network looks at 7 symbols at a time. So that it is actually looking at, and each character is represented by a binary vector. So since there are 29 possible symbols at any given position, so this is how the input is given. So the input is shown here. So I hope you can see my cursor. So input is shown here, and you have letters, and these are blank spaces, right? And these are letters, and so I could, this is, so it is, you give 7 symbols at a time, so 7 characters at a time. You have to output or predict the sound of the central character, right? What is it? This happens to be the phoneme k, right? So this is the symbol for the phoneme in the output k. So you also have punctuation here, like blank spaces and all that. So since there are 26 plus 3, 29 symbols, these 29 symbols are represented by binary vector. So suppose you have letter A, it is represented as 1000 followed by 28 zeros. Letter B is 0100 followed by 27 zeros, and so on. So it's a very simple binary representation. So it have a huge input matrix, is the huge matrix of size 29 by 7 dimension. So that's the input dimensionality. Then hidden layer has 18 neurons. So it's a very tiny network, especially compared to modern standards. And they've chosen this window size of 7 based on visual information. That is, a given character or pronunciation of a given character. Right? How many neighboring characters influence it? How far should you go into the neighborhood to understand the exact pronunciation of a given character? the people found that about 3 neighbors is good enough. Beyond that, it's not very informative. So that's why they have taken window of 7 characters. So they have taken words from a pocket dictionary, about 20,000 words, and they were read out by they were taken as utterances from a child's running speech. Right, and totally 1,000 words were taken from this dictionary, and the network is trained on that. So performance on the trained network, right, improved gradually with time, saturating after some time, and so it reached about 95% accuracy after training the network with about 50,000 words. And hidden layer presence is very important. When they trained a perceptron, it didn't learn that well. It saturated pretty prematurely. Whereas if you add a hidden layer, that really improved performance. So in this graph, these numbers 0, 15, etc. indicate the number of hidden neurons. So 0 means there is no hidden layer at all. So 15 means there are 15 hidden neurons in that one hidden layer. So as you add hidden neurons, the performance gets better. Okay, and also, so what they do is when they get an output for the network, which itself is actually in the form of a vector. So each of the phonemes is also given a vector representation. All right, so they, based on the actual output of the network, they look at which of the template vectors is it closest to. Okay, and that is called the best guess. Right, if you take the output as it is, it will not give very high performance, but they take the network output and then compare it with the existing words, the existing phoneme vectors, and see which is closest. And based on when you do that, the performance is higher. Now, what is interesting is the objective of this study is not to read text very efficiently and all. The modern networks do a lot better, very well. But the idea is to just to look at the trends in the network's learning, and is there any connection with how humans learn? So if you look at this, in the early stage of network, its utterances was very similar to, it was doing what is called popularly babbling. That is, it was only saying ba ba ba, ga ga ga, pa pa la la la, things like that. Okay, so although the training data had a lot of complex variations of sound, network output was falling in very simple patterns like ba ba ba, ka ka ka. Now that's interesting because that's exactly how babies talk. That's why it's even called babbling. It's one of the first sounds they can utter as ba ba ba. So that's called babbling. Now network is also doing that, but as a trained network further and further in a second stage of learning, the network learn to pause at word boundaries, right? And so it will blabber something and then pause, blabber something and pause. Okay, so these resemble like pseudo words. It is saying something, it is not a legal word, a valid word, and it's pausing between words. Okay, that is what it's learned. After 10 epochs, epoch is one presentation of the entire training set. And the text was understandable, it was intelligible. And after training, they found that even the errors were quite meaningful, because instead of thesis, it might say these, which is very reasonable. It's a decent mistake. It's not totally off. And sometimes actually what was labeled as a wrong output by the network, in fact, was not a wrong output. There were errors in annotation. So the test data itself had bugs. So network was giving correct response, but the test data had bugs. So that's why it is labeled wrongly. So network performance was 78%, which is not bad. This is one of the first attempts of this kind. But if you look at more modern, I'm not following literature in deep learning area in this topic, but I'm sure it is a lot better than this. Speech recognition has improved tremendously, as you know from examples like Alexa. Okay, so then one of the things about this network is robustness against damage. Because I said in the last class, one of the key things about brain is its extreme fault tolerance. We looked at the example of Phineas Gage and how even though a crowbar went through his head, nothing happened. He survived the accident. So similarly, what happens if you damage network's weights? So people used to do a lot of these studies in the early days, but now people don't care. So if you just, so they added noise to weights of amplitude between minus 0.5 and 0.5. And they found that, even with such a strong damage network showed 7% accuracy. But what is interesting is when you damage a network like that, and up to a point where its performance is 67%, which is what you see here, right? And so now you damage the network and then start training it from that point onwards. So you take a pre-trained network, damage it, and you note that the pre-trained network was giving a performance of, let us say, 90 plus performance percent. Now when you damage the weights, it has dropped to 67%. Now you train again this damaged network. So what you would expect is it will also take as much time as the original network, but no, that's not what happened. The network now learned the task much faster. Well, you see which is shown by the upper graph. Okay, it was learning. The bottom graph is original learning curve, where it took a long time to reach that 90%. Whereas the network which is damaged, which is a damaged version of the original network, was showing very bad performance initially. It was not following the same flat curve. It was rising much faster, right? And even went to a slightly higher performances than what the original network did. Now, one great comparison of this to real human performance is stroke rehabilitation. So just consider what happens when a person gets stroke. Now, stroke is an impairment that occurs due to damage to some part of the brain, which occurs because of loss of blood supply in that part of the brain. So when there's no blood, neurons die. Unfortunately, once neurons die, there's no question of regeneration of new neurons. That can happen in other tissues in the body, but in the brain, once some cells die, that's all. They don't come back. Of course, there's only one part of the brain called hippocampus, where within hippocampus there is a part called dentate gyrus, where neurons can grow even in an adult brain. It's called adult neurogenesis. So whereas it doesn't happen anywhere else, at least not to my knowledge, in the brain. So when stroke people undergo rehabilitation, suppose there is a stroke in some part of the brain which controls speech. Right after the accident, suddenly the person has problems speaking. He or she cannot speak at all. So then they undergo some therapy, and very quickly after about maybe a month or two of training, the speech might completely come back. It's possible. Now you see that the same person would have taken years to learn to speak normally, right from childhood. And when the accident occurred, suddenly the speech is completely gone. But from that point onwards to back to almost normal speech, they cover that entire trajectory within a short span of a couple of months. That's the kind of thing you see here in this neural network. Once you damage it, it comes back to normal much faster. The other things which they observed, which are quite interesting, that is different sounds or different mappings of character and sound are learned at different rates. So for example, the letter C to the sound K mapping, letter C to the sound SA mapping was learned by the network at differential rates. So for example, letter C to SA, right, it took longer for the network to learn. So that is this curve, right, like a C as in facade or nice. Whereas C as in K, it learned faster. And apparently children also show this kind of a difficulty in learning to distinguish these two sounds, these two variations of the C sound. And probably this is happening probably because this hard C mapped onto cat, or C, C uh, takes longer, yeah. So it occurs twice as often as a soft C in the corpus, so therefore it is learned faster. Okay, so to summarize this, during early stages of learning, the sounds produced were uncannily similar to early speech sounds in children. So that was what the designers of this network have observed when they heard the output of the network. And patterns of error produced by the damaged network are similar to reading errors of individuals with acquired dyslexia. So I talked about stroke, but even acquired dyslexia. So there's a problem. So these are dyslexics are people who have trouble reading, right? And the kind of errors that they make is very similar to the kind of errors that the damaged network made. which is quite interesting because the point of this kind of exercise is the model is very simple. I mean, we're not trying to model brain as it is, right? The areas of the brains are involved in language function. We have no knowledge of that, or they have no knowledge of had no knowledge of that when they designed this network. It's a very generic network, just trained on some general data. But in its behavior, in its function, in its function in impaired form, the network is already emulating real human subjects, which gives a lot of insight into what does it take to model brain, right, to understand brain function. So then to reproduce human intonation possibly perhaps higher context is required. So then 7, which is understood, because if you to understand paucity, you should hold the entire sentence in your mind before you plan your pronunciation. So you cannot just look at 7 characters at a time and try to understand whether your stress has to go down or go up by the end of the sentence, things like that. For that you need to understand where is the end of the sentence coming, when is it coming, right? Anyway, so we'll stop there. I just want to give a flavor of how even a simple network like this, which can be understood intuitively without even any mathematics, right? You can give an insight into how brain learns things. So let us stop there. So then I'll just take a 20-second break and move on to the next component of this talk. Yeah. So now that we have seen how simple MLP can learn, some simple language tasks and emulate brain function both in normal conditions and disease conditions or dysfunctional conditions. So now we are ready to take a closer look at brain. So normally at this stage, people just start looking at neuroanatomy closely and right, and various vision processes in the brain, various touch processes in the brain, kind of mug up all the names of all the brain areas and so on. That's what, and if you're a doctor, for example, if you're an MBBS student, if you're taking a basic course on neurophysiology, that's what you would start right at this time. But let us kind of postpone that exercise a little bit, or we'll go about it, but in a slightly different fashion, not in the traditional kind of a fashion of a medical student. So first of all, to understand brain's complex behaviors, what is great about brain is its complex behavior, right? We need to understand that we don't need to know the brain in all its fantastic detail. We need to understand the logic of brain's underlying architecture. If you understand that, you can easily understand its complex behaviors. It's not important for you to understand and mug up all the different brain areas and their names and things like that. To get an intuition of what I'm talking about, I want to mention this book called Vehicles, Experiments in Synthetic Psychology. It's written by a neuroanatomist called Valentino Breitenberg. Breitenberg is an anatomist. He studied brains, animal brains, human brains, at a microscopic level. So he would study things like the density of neurons in a given part of the brain, the number of wires sticking out of the neuron, the thicknesses of the wire, and the branching patterns of the wire, and so on. So very low level microscopic data, anatomical data, structural data about neural tissue. That's the kind of research he has done. But quite surprisingly, he's also written a very elegant book called Vehicles, which tries to give an insight into how does the nervous system work. But to explain that, he would just design these thought experiments, right, involving very simple vehicles. These vehicles are kind of simplistic representations of a nervous system and a body or an animal. So what does the nervous system do? It takes sensory inputs from different sensory organs and drives the motor apparatus of the organ and therefore of the body of the organism, and therefore the body responds to the stimuli coming from the environment. Now, since we kind of believe that since brain is so complicated, the response of the organism to environment is so complicated, and that's why it looks very intelligent and all that. But what Breitenberg likes to show is that you don't need to have a very complex brain to produce complex behavior. Even a very simple organization, right, when it is reacting to a world which is complex, right, it will show complex behavior. So the complexity is coming because of the world complexity, not necessarily the complexity of the nervous system, right? So you can really shows how surprisingly complex behaviors can be elicited by very simple architectures. So one of his first vehicles in the book that he introduces is on this slide. It's just like a box, and in the front of this box there is a sensor which is a photoreceptor, a photo light sensor, and the closer it is to a light source, the stronger is the signal it picks up, and the sensor then sends a signal to the, so this is a sensor, right, and then that sends a signal to this motor. There's a wheel, right, and this signal simply sends a signal to this wheel, and the signal is strong, the wheel runs faster, spins faster. Signal is weak, wheel spins slower. That's all. This is the machine. Now let us see what happens. So if you arrange it, if you orient the, so obviously you can see that the machine cannot, this vehicle cannot turn because the wheel is rigidly fixed. It can only turn, but it cannot make the vehicle turn left and right. So for that, you need to have some kind of a bilaterality. You need to have wheels on the left and the right, and then they should spin differentially for the vehicle to turn. And the wheel itself should be able to turn. It should, right, it should be able to turn like this in addition to spinning on its axis. There's no such option in this vehicle. So what happens is if it is far from the light source, right, it will move slowly but towards the light source. As it gets closer and closer to the light source, the signal is stronger and stronger. The wheels spin faster and faster. So it will go faster and faster towards light source and until it completely bangs into the light source. So the response is, the behavior is not very great. It's kind of aggressive, right? Nothing very interesting. But things start looking very interesting the moment you have two sides to the vehicle. So the vehicle has two sides and there are one wheel on either side. And instead of one sensor, if you have two sensors on either side of the vehicle. And so that gives an intuition about why our bodies are bilateral and how our bilateral bodies can show such rich behavior. The two sensors in the front, two wheels in the back, and the right sensor connects to the right wheel, left sensor connects to the left wheel. And the relationship between the sensor and the wheel is one of positive interaction or influence. That is, if there's stronger signal from this side, it will turn this wheel faster. If it is a weaker signal, it will turn the wheel slower. So what happens now when it is, let's say the vehicle is oriented like this. At this point, this sensor gets more signal than the left sensor. The right signal gets more signal than the left sensor. So therefore, the right wheel spins faster than the left wheel. So that will make the vehicle turn to the left.
Yeah.
Right. So that means as it is coming from, vehicle is coming from a distance, any small asymmetry, any small deviation from the perfectly straight on motion, right, will be amplified and the vehicles will start turning to the left. But something else happens when you crisscross the wires. This crisscrossing of wires is also interesting from a brain point of view. Because in the brain, hello, can you please mute yourself? Hello, please mute yourself and turn off your video. So when you crisscrossing of wires is also very important from again neuroscience point of view because this crisscrossing occurs all the time, right? When your sensory inputs come from, like, let's say two eyes, right? A lot of information from left eye goes to the right brain, and information from the right eye goes to the left brain, and similarly, information from your right hand goes to the left brain, and so on and so forth. Okay, so crisscrossing of wires from left to right as they enter the brain is very common. So just to capture that, he has taken this this option. So in a crisscross, again, the weightage is simply positive. But so when you do that, something interesting happens. So this sensor is closer to the light source. It gives a strong signal. Therefore, the left sensor picks up strong signal. So therefore, the right wheel spins faster. Right. So it will turn towards the light source wherever it is. And as it comes closer to the light source, both sensors pick up stronger and stronger signals, so that both wheels turn faster. So and therefore, right, they kind of it's actually it picks up speed as it comes closer to light source, and then completely bangs into the light source. And when you look at this kind of a behavior, you might think that suppose you don't know that this is all a machine, right? Suppose it looks like a frog or some animal or something like a puppy or something. In fact, if you want to put, you can put some kind of a paint a picture of some animal on the surface of this, so that all internal wires are hidden. You'll think that this animal hates light, right? It really likes to destroy all light sources, some kind of a photophobia. But something else happens if you just change again about roughly the same architecture, but you take a negative influence or positive influence. So then what happens is, uh, as it comes closer and closer to light source, the signal picked up is stronger. Therefore, the strong signal now turns the wheel slower because influence is negative. So therefore, in this case also, the vehicle, you can easily work out, the vehicle turns towards the light source, but as it comes closer to light source, unlike the previous vehicle, it slows down, and just as it completely approaches the light source, it completely stops. So then you might say that it is quietly adoring the light source. It really admires light sources, and wherever there it finds light sources, it will go there to light source and just sit there and admire those light sources, without bashing into them and destroying them. Okay, so that is how this machine, this vehicle behaves. Now the fourth vehicle, which is again very similar to the previous ones, only difference is there's negative influence between the sensor and the wheel, and there's crisscrossing of wires. And you can easily see that when this happens, it won't turn towards light source. So when it is far off from the light source, the signal picked up by sensors is weak. Therefore, the wheels turn faster. So it will quickly rush towards light source. But once it comes very close to light source, because of the differential activation of the two sensors, right, it will slow down and start turning away from the light source. And once it comes very close, it completely turn away. So it's like, it looks very strange for this outside observer, who doesn't know what's happening inside. It looked like as if this fellow, when it is far from the light source, he like to go towards light source at a very high velocity. But as it is coming closer and closer to the light source, it's kind of changed its mind, right? And then turned away from light source, as if it is fickle and fanciful. Its affections for the light source are not stable. It's fickle and fanciful, right? Okay, so thing is very simple vehicles like this, which are models of very simple nerve systems, which just have some sensors and some motor apparatuses, right? Can show extremely complex and interesting and elegant behaviors, just by virtue of how they place with respect to the world, right? So even simple organizations of nervous system can produce complex behaviors. So that's what we can learn from that. And the wiring patterns that are considered in this model by Breitenberg are actually quite representative of the kind of wiring patterns you see in real nervous systems. This crisscrossing and presence of lots of sensors in the front, right, and motor apparatus in the back. All that we have discussed in a different context. So he has taken all that and showed that something interesting can happen. Okay, so now if you look at nervous system, organization of nervous system, straight away you can say that there are two major divisions of nervous system. I think I even mentioned this once before. So the nervous system is present in two places. One is inside this bony cage, the vertebral column for the spinal cord, and the cranium, the skull, for the brain proper. So there's a lot of neural tissue here, and then there are nerves or the bundles of fibers, right, that come out of the brain, right, and then feed the eyes and mouth and nose and all that. I'm not showing all that here. Right, both carries information in both directions. Okay, and that is one thing. And then lots of bundles of fibers come out of the spinal cord, right, and go out into the body and innervating it, and both passing signals to the body and receiving signals from the body. So it passes signals for motor function to move your hand and things like that. to the body, and from the body it receives inputs like the from your touch input from your skin, or the muscle tension information from your muscle and things like that. Lots of things, okay, are received by the nervous system, right? So now these wires that go out of the central nervous system into the body, all these together are called the peripheral nervous system. All these wires together are called the peripheral nervous system. And all the neural tissue that is located inside the vertebral column and inside the cranium, that is called the central nervous system. So you can think of this, right, again to use a computer analogy, you can think of the central nervous system as a CPU, and peripheral nervous system as whatever is all the wires that connect your CPU to the monitor and the printer and things like that. That's your peripheral nervous system. So within the central nervous system, you have lots of important structures. There is the cerebrum, right, which are these two hemispheres, right, that you prominently know as the brain. The cerebellum, which is the small structure in the back of the brain. Then you have brainstem, which consists of midbrains, pons, and medulla. And then below that, you have the spinal cord. So you can see that here, this is the brainstem. Okay, and you see pons, medulla, and midbrain is somewhere here in this area. So cerebellum can be seen here very clearly. A fairly large structure. And you can think of cerebellum itself as a little brain. So that is what its name means, cerebellum. Because it has its own internal structure, it has its own surface of cells called, which is like the cortex of the main hemisphere, main cerebrum. Right? It's like a little brain because it has all the earmarks of a brain. Then these are the hemispheres. This is cerebrum. The pink stuff in this figure, it's all cerebrum. So now the next brilliant question that we are all waiting for, an exciting question is, how does brain work? Which part of the brain does what? So now if you dig up medical textbooks or websites which have a strong kind of medicine orientation or medical orientation, you will see charts like this. Right? What does the frontal lobe do? Because cerebrum has all these four major lobes. Right? We talked about this very early on in the course. So this is the frontal lobe, this is the parietal lobe, this is the temporal lobe, and this is the occipital lobe. Now, what do they do? Frontal lobe, it controls movement, it is involved in intelligence, it does reasoning, behavior, memory, and personality. Temporal lobe, what does it do? It does speech, it does behavior, memory, hearing, vision, emotion. What does parietal lobe do? It does intelligence, reasoning, right and left distinction, language, sensation. Okay, so now let's wait here for a second. These are the kinds of things I just picked it up from the internet, some random figure from the internet. But just look at this figure. Let's look at it more critically. Frontal lobe does intelligence, movement, okay, and behavior, whatever that reasoning, whatever the hell that means. Parietal lobe, it does again intelligence, again it does reasoning, again it doesn't do behavior apparently. Behavior is done by somebody else. Okay, temporal lobe does behavior and memory, and it doesn't do reasoning. The point is, if intelligence is done by frontal lobe and parietal lobe, why are both doing the same thing? What's the difference, or what's the connection? So point is, you just by putting some random word, just because somebody asked you, okay, what does the frontal lobe do? Right? If you throw some random words at it, it doesn't mean you understand. It doesn't mean you're able to explain what is going on in frontal lobe. So people just put these random labels on, what different parts of the brain does, and people think they understood, or they conveyed something very intelligent, very interesting. Okay, so the problem is, this is exactly how you confuse, right, our understanding of the brain and confuse people about that such understanding. To explain why it is wrong is a wrong way of going about the problem. Let me give you a small analogy. So I'll give you clues to a poem, right? You should be able to tell me what the poem is. Okay, the third word of the poem is third word of the first line is A. Okay, and the fourth word of the second line is in. and the sixth word of the third line is of. The fourth word of the fourth line is an. Now, like this, I'll give you the coordinates of different words in different lines in this poem. I'll go on and down like this. It might take me some half an hour to give you the data for the entire poem. You have to remember all that and give me the full structure, of full kind of identity of the poem. Actually, it's a very nice poem. I've kind of ruined it completely. It's by a British poet William Blake, English poet. To see a world in a grain of sand and a heaven in the wild flower. Hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. So, okay, so you can see that, in the first line, the third word is A and so on and so forth. So, point is, unless you see the words in a right sequence, the poem doesn't make any sense. And even if I give you the coordinates of the word, in the poem, if you don't visit those words in the right sequence, the poem looks all wild. So brain looks so complicated, because of such descriptions, which are very commonly seen even in popular textbooks. Because it's like saying cerebellum controls balance and coordination of movement, right? And your frontal lobe also controls movement. So what's the difference? Because we don't know. Because we don't know, we just put some random words on. So this is quite confusing. So let us see what is the right way to, or a much simpler way to, intuitive way to understand brain. Simplest way to understand brain is to think of brain as an input-output system. Why is that? Because I'm coming to this point from simple neural network point of view. Because that's what we have done until this point. Until this point, we haven't really learned anything about brain. We just learned about neural networks. Now, from that background, how would you approach brain? So we'll just take this very simple toy picture. Okay, I don't know much about brain, but I know brain has input and output. Inputs come from sensory inputs, and outputs are motor outputs. Like, I look at something and I activate my hand, in response to that. So somebody throws me a ball, right, and that ball is coming towards me, and I see that in my eyes. The image of the ball grows in my retina. That information is sent to my brain, and brain takes some reactive measures and sends signals to my hand, and my hand moves and catches the ball. So there is a sensory input as a motor output. This I can understand well. I would imagine that the sensory input goes to a layer of neurons. That layer in turn projects to another layer, and that in turn projects to another layer. I could be having, I don't know, some 50 layers in between. Finally, the last layer sends commands to my hands, my muscles of my hand, and then hand moves. Okay, that's an easy thing to understand. So instead of just 3 layers, maybe there are 50 layers, 15 layers, it doesn't matter. Just a detail, right? And that's how it goes. Now let us unpack this further, right? This sound, the sensory input, there's not just one general sensory input, there are different kinds of sensory input. So you can have auditory input or sound input. You can have visual input, right, or vision. You can have tactile input or somatosensory input, which we normally call touch. So all these come to different parts of the brain. These are like input ports of the brain, right? And then that information goes through a bunch of layers, right? And obviously they are not all going through parallel and independent pipelines or pathways in the brain, because there's a lot of overlap, right? Because I'm holding an apple, I'm eating an apple. I'm looking at the apple, I can see that it is red, and when I bite it, it suddenly exposes its kind of a creamy white light, with a light greenish tinge, that creamy white interior. And when I hold it in my hand, I can see that it is fairly hard. I mean, it's not like a banana, right? Much harder than a banana. And when I bite into it, it gives a crunchy feel. So all this comes from touch, and the appearance of it, its roundness and its redness, all that comes from vision. And so obviously I must be processing these two streams of information together and combining them somehow to create the concept of an apple. Otherwise, we'll never understand that these colors and this touch information come together to create the concept of an apple. Okay, so obviously these pathways should meet somewhere in the brain. So then, like that, information propagates through a whole bunch of layers and crosses many layers, and finally goes to the output. And output can go to many different sources, many different outputs. Like I could be just turning my eyes towards the apple, So for that, my commands have to go to the eyes. Or I could be reaching out, right, by moving my hands and reaching out to the apple. Okay, or maybe I'm seeing a rotten apple on the street and I'm just tossing it aside with my feet, right? Then the commands have to go. Input is apple, output is a command to the leg. Or I'm looking at the apple and I'm so inspired, I'm writing a poem on apple. So I'm singing some songs in praise of apple. So for that, my output has to go to my speech apparatuses. So input comes from many sources. All these different sources of information flows, right? This information flows through many different layers of neurons. Output again goes to many different output ports, right? So if you understand this, some of the architecture of the brain looks pretty simple. Okay, so we'll come to that. So then again, when it comes to control, there are multiple levels of control. So just like, for example, I don't know. So if you are a research student or undergrad student or whatever, suppose you have an issue, you immediately take it up with your course advisor or course instructor or faculty advisor. Faculty advisor is not able to resolve it. You go to the HOD. HOD is not able to resolve it. Then you go to academic section and talk to the dean academics and so on, right? So there are levels of control in any complex organization. So similarly, even in the brain, there are levels of control. The lowest level of control happens straight away at the level of spinal cord, right? If you, let's say you're walking and then you step on something sharp, immediately the signal goes to the spinal cord and the reaction comes back from the spinal cord level and withdrawing your hand, right? That's called a reflex. And that reflex happens all at the lowest level at the level of spinal cord. But some information goes to even higher levels, can go to the midbrain level and return back, right? And it can, or some information can even go higher all the way to the motor cortex and again come back. Those three levels can be seen here. So the highest level is the cortical level. Next level is the subcortical level. And the lowest is the spinal cord level. So there are these levels. Okay, so maybe we should stop there. So I've just set the stage to understand brain's organization. So next class, we'll actually go into the details and see what are these major areas. And where do you place different brain areas on this picture, right? Because the thing is, here the flow of information is very intuitive and simple to understand. But in the brain, all these areas are totally tangled, right? They don't come in such neatly arranged. And even this picture, suppose I mix up all the purples and the greens and the yellows, right, and then try to understand what is going on. It looks very complicated. But if you untangle them and put this in this order, in the sequential form, it becomes very obvious, right? So like this, even in the brain, different areas are all mixed up because of maybe it's trying to optimize some wire length or something like that. But if you put them in logical order, it's very simple to understand what's going on. So let us try to do that in the next class.